A documentary film crew lost at sea and shipwrecked on a mysterious island full of monsters and intrigue. A billionaire who knows more than it seems, and his bodyguards struggling to keep him alive. An evil lurking in the jungle, stalking them in a deadly game. This is Point Nemo. Point Nemo is a one-shot sci-fi survival RPG launching Tuesday, November 2nd on Kickstarter. This is the second adventure written for the 3-2-1 action RPG rule set and is loaded with cool playable characters, crazy charts, malicious monsters, and wild weapons. This full-length adventure can be played over the course of one night or broken up into individual episodes and features several fun side quests and interesting island destinations. So if you're ready to rumble in the jungle, be sure to join us for some action, November 2nd on Kickstarter.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. I would try to make a joke about a treasure hunt, but then I just walk into the clubhouse, and there it all is, Stu Horvath.
Yes, indeed. We actually have kind of like a nautical themed adventure. This is about some boats, and we have the feature at the back, which is also about some boats.
Yeah, we do. At the end of the episode, we have another Indie RPG elevator pitch brought to you by our friends over at Exalted Funeral. Tonight, we're going to chat a little bit with Tristan Zimmerman about his new Kickstarter for Shanty Hunters.
I guess you're not supposed to call them boats. They're ships, right?
I've heard it both ways, but I've also never been in the Navy, so I feel like, I can get away with it.
It's a shame we record these in reverse order, or we could just ask.
Now that he's off of the show, and that's, a little inside baseball for you, dear listener. We knock the interview out at the top of the hour when we record, then we go back and record the first half of it. However, now you know how the sausage is made. Anyway, Stu, why don't you tell our listeners about Treasure Hunt?
Sorry, revealing trade secrets. So Treasure Hunt is module N4 for the old first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. N stands for novice. Did you know that?
I did not.
Yeah. So the idea here is to create a series of adventures that are, I don't know what, because they're not very good introductory adventures for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, at least N1 through 3 aren't. And this is sort of true of all of the low level Advanced Dungeons and Dragons adventures. They're low level, but they're not introductory. Those things aren't the same thing, right?
Oh, they are not the same thing at all.
Yeah. So like you look at the B1, B2, like they're sort of giving you information on how to run the game, how to play the game, and like giving you like these, railings and structure and guidance throughout the process to kind of teach. And the N series don't really do that. And they're really kind of a mixed bag up until Treasure Hunt. N2, the Forest Oracle, is often cited as one of the worst Dungeons and Dragons adventures ever written.
Really?
Yes.
That's an auspicious title.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's a lot of competition, right? I was looking for stuff to throw on the feed, and I was sort of like thinking like, oh God, and these are just going to be totally bad all the way through. Then I hit N4 Treasure Hunt, and I was shocked actually, because it's pretty great. It is maybe the best introductory D&D scenario written in the first era of AD&D, at least.
Wow, that's a bold claim there.
Yeah. So this is AD&D. So remember, like, it's not Dungeons and Dragons like the BECME or BX or any of that stuff. This is definitely geared towards Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is a slightly different, more complicated system. And there was just a general assumption at the time that you already knew how it worked if you're playing the advanced game. That's why they called it advanced. This one kind of breaks from that tradition, right? And there's not just like B1, you kind of get the setup, like a note to the players, and like, this is what you do. And then you have at it. This one, actually, there's framework throughout the entire adventure, constantly kind of like addressing both players and the DM in ways to kind of like teach them how to play. It's broken up into 6 parts. I'll sort of get into the details in a little bit, but one thing I want to talk about right off the bat is that these 6 parts each have sort of like a guidebook, sort of painstakingly detailing all of the ways the players can kind of mess things up and giving advice to the DM on how to correct that. And it's just genius. It's so informative. First of all, Aaron Alston, who wrote the thing, he was really smart and it's very meticulous. And he kind of covers everything that I could think of off the top of my head. Now, granted, they always throw you a curveball, players. That's what they do. But I think if you're a first time DM, you're going to be extremely well equipped to kind of deal with any kind of weird and wild behavior on your players' part. And I think that that alone is like such a massive accomplishment. You don't see that kind of support in early D&D at all. And this is not only like, does it exist, but it's so total and so well crafted that like, I think that this is one of the best D&D intros, period. It's really good.
I mean, it sounds like it. It definitely sounds like something that I was kind of clamored for when I was first getting into the hobby, you know, which would make me feel a little braver about running a game for people for the first time. And also, you know, as a player, kind of like looking back through it, because, you know, I used to love reading through the modules after they were run for me, because I was always curious to see like what we didn't find or what we didn't get. And, you know, you're not going to run through them again unless you run them for someone else. You're not going to be able to. And I know this is a pretty broad statement, but I genuinely think it's going to take years for a person to really forget the adventure, especially if you had a good time with it. So like when I ran Ravenloft for everybody, you know, it had been almost a decade or more since any of you had run and been a part of Ravenloft. So I felt confident doing it that you wouldn't remember every little thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, I always love to go back and read the modules. And as a player, man, I would have gotten a kick out of seeing the kind of things that you're describing in Treasure Hunt.
So yeah, it's just does it so well. My perception is tinted a little bit because it stands out. It's so different from everything else from the period that I might be overselling it a little bit. I do think that it's a really great introduction. And it manages to do a couple other things that are really cool. So the first thing that it does that's really cool is, you know, one of the things that I hate most about D&D modules?
What's that?
The ones that take away all of your stuff.
Oh, my worst.
So it happens in the Slave Lords. It happens all the time. I feel like I just kind of constantly am coming across it where like you're captured by the bad guys through some stupid contrived plot where you're left helpless. They take your stuff, they lock you up, and you have to fend for yourself, right? One of the Ravenloft adventures that I just posted about does it, and that was in the 90s. It's like, oh man, like I just hate that. It takes away all of your player's agency. It takes away the character's agency, and it always like requires you to kind of like murder all of the openness and the naturalness of your story to kind of make that kind of thing happen. It just bums. It's always a bummer, especially when like there isn't a clear signal that, dude, you're going to get your stuff back, you know, like.
Can I tell you that's exactly the reason why I stopped watching The Walking Dead? Because the thing that I hate the most in RPGs is the same thing. It's just like, well, we worked really hard to not die up until this point, yet somehow you miraculously managed to capture us, subdue us, take all our shit that we killed a lot of other shit to get, and now we have to fight our way out of wherever we are. It totally like puts me off, and to the point where like, you know what, I can stomach that once, you know, because maybe one time it seems like a good idea. Maybe one time it does change things up a little bit to maybe start you off. And you know what, most dungeon masters never actually started you off like at that thing where it's just like, oh, where does season 2 pick up? Well, somehow you guys ended up in this dungeon. And that I can maybe tolerate a little more, but the whole like, oh yeah, so you're suddenly captured. It's just like, no, we have enough ammo, and we have like one of these guys has a wish on a ring. There's no way we're getting captured, but suddenly you're captured. You stripped all your stuff, and that's why I stopped watching The Walking Dead, because I was like, God, how many times can these guys get captured?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Treasure Hunt is that it spins on this capture motif and actually makes it work, and that dovetails with the next cool thing. Is that this is the adventure that introduces the idea of 0 level characters. I originally thought, up until I read this, that 0 level characters were introduced in Greyhawk Adventures in 1988. I was wrong. They actually debut in this, which is a couple years before that, in 86. Although I think it came out in January of 87, but the copyright information is all 86. So the idea here is that you play regular folks who have been captured by pirates, and you're basically galley slaves in the boat, ship, whatever. And you basically are either using the pre-generated characters or a really stripped down character creation process to create people who are just normal people with jobs. You know, it leans a bit on the secondary skill, which is basically like craft. So you could be like a blacksmith or a fletcher or like a farmer or stuff like that. You get like a skill that's associated with that has very limited application in the combat tactical play of D&D, but is there for sort of flavor. And that's all you get. In this, I think, is the way that you kind of get through the knot of capture stories, is that you start there. You know, you are weak characters, right? And you have been captured. And like you start your adventuring life as galley slaves, torn from the life that you used to know. And I think that just kind of works naturally. And the idea of zero level characters is awesome. So there was never really like a systematized way of going about it. The Greyhawk rules were kind of odd, but this guides you through it step by step. Basically, each character has a checklist, and anytime they do something that sort of is associated with a class, they get a check. Same thing with alignment too. Your alignment isn't determined in character creation. Your alignment is determined through play, with the DM kind of just constantly tracking your behavior. And then at the end of the game, I think there might be a spot sort of towards the end where you get to potentially level. And once you do, you gain a class, but you do so based on your actions to that point. I just think that that's such a kind of wonderful, organic way to kind of play that was mostly not used in D&D historically, you know?
I find that to be wildly interesting.
Right?
And I find that to be like, especially because it's a learning kind of how to play D&D and understand D&D. I think a lot of people come to D&D with a very specific idea of what alignment means. And that's very much consistently opposed to how they actually play their character. Like,
yeah.
It's like night and day. So I think that's actually pretty neat that you actually determine your alignment and your class by the way that you try to break out of this dungeon and kind of see who you are in, the mix. I love a show called Leverage. For years. They just redid it, Leverage Redemption. And it's hitter, hacker, thief, grifter. Everyone's got a role on the team. And I think it's kind of cool to come to that naturally rather than saddling up to the table and being like, oh, I guess I'll be the cleric.
Yeah. And like, it doesn't work if you're an experienced player. I can't see us sitting around the table and doing this because like it's so ingrained in us that we're going to do the meta and kind of like game the test to get the result that we want. Like those personality tests. It's like, oh, I want to be an artist, so I'm just going to answer all the art questions. But for a new player, they don't have any kind of guardrails for this. And because they don't have any preconceived notions, they're just going to kind of do stuff, and they're going to get rewarded with sort of bits of like the D&D experience, the bits that they need, right? And it's just kind of a genius way to kind of present the game. And of course, like this is obviously like clear forerunner for Dungeon Crawl Classics funnel idea. I mean, like the idea of the funnel is you roll up like 7 characters or whatever, all 100% random, and they're all just like tradesmen, like bakers and candlestick makers, and you run them through this death trap dungeon, and the one that is left is the one that you play. That's like a crazy way of like doing it, because it's like over the top and gonzo, and that's sort of the vibe of DCC. But this is a much more sort of reasonable, not Academy Award winning, like we're not on the English patient scale, but like, it's sort of on that a more naturalistic, realistic kind of approach to it. I just think it's underexplored kind of mechanism for a D&D style game.
I think this is great. And I think fondly of the funnel nowadays where it's like, you make a character, good luck. I mean, that's kind of exciting to me. That's something I find appealing. And I think for me as a near lifelong player at this point, I would have loved something like this. This is a cool little experiment versus the classic standard right over the plate dungeon crawl. Like I kind of would like to fight my way out of something and figure my way out of something rather than knowing I can do this and whatever this is with whatever weapon is. But don't take that weapon from me when I'm a high enough level not to get captured, because I will get mad at you.
Yeah, no, like this is the perfect way to do it, right? Because D&D is a game about heroism, right? And eventually super heroism. Like You have swords and armor, but you're really, really a superhero game. And like to be thrust into an adverse situation and overcome it in like this kind of way is like it's the perfect kind of origin story. I really love it. Like if I ever and who knows if I'm ever going to run D&D like a real campaign again, but if I do, I'm going to start it this way because it's just so much more. I feel like you're just going to naturally invest more in your characters in a different kind of way, especially if like we could cobble together like a whole bunch of weird character options and like have like a bigger matrix of possible outcomes rather than your standard 4 or 5 character classes, right? I think that's just naturally interesting, and the rest of the adventure is really pretty good. So like you're sort of set up like you're gonna have to like figure out a way to escape the slavers, but you don't, because there's a shipwreck. You're marooned. You get involved with some magic stuff. There's 2 camps of pirates that are fighting each other. They're not just regular pirates, they're goblin pirates and orc pirates, which I think is just wonderful. I love the idea of like orc pirate. They really have like tricorn hats and stuff. It's just so good.
Little goblin dudes just like swapping the poop deck and getting crazy. Cannonballs.
And Stephen Fabian does the art. And it's earlier Stephen Fabian, so it's still stippled, and it's just like, oh, it's so good. There's also handout maps in the screen. You know how like the folder for the adventure always folds out? They're pretend written on palm leaves.
Oh, I love it.
Everything is so good. It's a great little scenario that sort of like speaks to interesting, underdeveloped, underexplored mechanics for Dungeons and Dragons. And I'd like to see more of it.
Very cool. Well, Studio, any final thoughts on Treasure Hunt?
I think that if you're interested in D&D, I think that if you've picked up the Young Adventurers guides and you want to dig deeper in and you haven't yet, I think that grabbing Treasure Hunt off of Drive-Thru is an excellent second step.
Very cool. All right, and as promised, we are back again with another indie RPG elevator pitch brought to you by our friends over at Exalted Funeral. Today, we are stoked. We're going to be talking to Tristan Zimmerman about Shanty Hunters. Now, this is on Kickstarter, ladies and gentlemen. As we are delivering this episode to you, Kickstarter is live on Shanty Hunters. It's going to be running now through December 2nd. So without further ado, Tristan, why don't you tell us a little bit about Shanty Hunters?
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me here. It's a genuine delight. Shanty Hunters is a tabletop RPG about collecting magical sea shanties in the year 1880. It's 1880. The age of sail, the age of commercial sail, is coming to a close as sail is being replaced by new steam technologies. And so too is ending the age of the shanty. Sea shanties are these historical maritime work songs. They're really wonderful. And they don't really exist on steamships. So you play as characters who are obsessed with documenting these shanties before they disappear. I say obsessed because there's a serious problem with documenting these shanties. They don't like falling into the hands of landsmen. So every time you document a new shanty, one that you have not written down the lyrics to before, the events and imagery in the lyrics come alive and they begin to play out on the ship that you're sailing aboard. And it's up to you then, you made this mess, it's up to you, the player characters, to deal with it, right? To anticipate the events, if you can, before they occur, because you've got the lyrics to the shanty right in front of you, and to figure out what to do with the events while they are occurring, how to respond to them, and potentially how to save the ship and everyone aboard her from this thing that you have wrought.
This is an incredible concept.
I love this so much.
I mean, we get a lot of people coming on and pitching some really cool stuff here. And surface, when you see something with pirates and sea shanties or imagining in that realm, you think this is going to go a certain way. But where I thought you were going to zig, you fully zagged with this. This is a really cool idea, and it's a really interesting way to approach some kind of maritime fun that I feel like we're going to have in this adventure. This is based on the gumshoe system, correct?
Yes, so this uses the Gumshoe rule system. It's a version of Gumshoe. I had to streamline it pretty seriously to optimize it for episodic play, because in Shanty Hunters, every shanty is its own adventure, right? And that means that every short adventure kind of winds up standing alone as its own self-enclosed story. Gumshoe is phenomenal. I can say this because it's not that I didn't write Gumshoe. Gumshoe legitimately is the best system out there for doing investigative RPGs, but it's not optimized originally for that sort of very fast turnover episodic play. So I had to make some changes in order to really streamline it right at that sweet spot.
And that's very cool because it doesn't seem to me like a game like this would really shine with your standard RPG fare and kind of rule sets, because this is a very, very specific kind of adventure, a very kind of freewheeling and fancy free style adventure, because you're on the high seas. You know, I love the concept of this. And I was really taken by the art. If you don't mind talking about the art for a second, I've been wanting to ask you about this. When I'm looking through the book, it says that the interior art comes from old books scanned from the British Library. What is that all about?
So the British Library is the UK's version of our Library of Congress. I'm sure somebody in the audience is now very grumpy that I didn't invert that, but they are doing a phenomenal job with scanning a lot of their older books and then just putting these high-res scans up on the internet as public domain for anybody to use. So what I did was I went and I pulled down all these wonderful illustrations from these period books and cleaned them up, got them ready for use in a digital product. Of course, I recommend viewing the book in physical form, but digital has its own image requirements that these images weren't necessarily designed for. So I had to clean them up for that. But what it allowed me to do was to kind of lavishly illustrate this book. I'm very pleased with just how fully illustrated this book is, and do it for really no money, which, boy, as just a single creator, is really great to be able to put out a gorgeous, fully lovingly illustrated book using all of these public domain images.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. When I started flipping through it, I was like, he got some really beautiful art. I was like, man, I wonder who he got to do this. And then I'm scrolling through it and I was like, well, that's very clever. And also the art is absolutely incredible with this. Now, you talked about preferably reading it as a physical book. This is a very thick book. Are you doing physical and PDF rewards?
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, this is wildly unhelpful because podcasts are an audio medium, but I'm holding up the physical book in front of the camera right now. I'm gonna thump it next to the microphone.
I feel like I do this a lot. I'm constantly describing my gestures to Hambone, who isn't even in the room. I don't even have a video camera on. So
yeah, we got some real War of the World stuff going on here. It's all the theater of the mind. But dear listener, I can tell you, he's held up the book. It is thick.
Large.
I like to think it's exactly the size it should be because, of course, sailing and the maritime profession are complicated. And I, as the author, don't want to assume any knowledge on the part of the reader because that's silly, right? I don't want to limit this to like, oh, if you haven't read all the Horatio Hornblower novels, get out of here. Like, no, this is a game for everybody. So the book really includes all of the information you might want. Not that I expect you or that you even should like go through and memorize it. Again, that would be silly. It's there so that if you're designing an adventure and this particular thing might be relevant, it's right there for you to look it up and drop it into your adventure. Everything you need.
So how did this come about? Magical shanties, like collecting them before the death of the age of sail. Like, what was the genesis of this idea? And like, how did you like... Was it a bolt out of the blue? You were like, yes, I know what the next one's going to be. Or did like you kind of start with, I want to do something about Age of Sail and kind of like came together, you know, bit by bit? Like, how did the whimsy come into being?
So I knew I wanted to do something with documenting historical songs before they were lost. And I had this whole idea of like, and then the songs recapitulate, right? They come alive and, oh dear, I did this. And now I need to kind of put the genie back in the bottle before anybody gets hurt. And my wife suggested like, hey, Tristan, you really love shanties, right? Why don't you make it about shanties? Great, awesome idea. But also this book wound up being very much a love letter to the maritime profession. We went to sea before my first birthday. I come from a sailing family. When I was a little kid, you know, we sailed all over. We sailed down the eastern seaboard. We sailed to Cuba. We sailed to the Dry Tortugas. After I graduated college, I joined the Navy. With the Navy, I circumnavigated the globe. I crossed the line off Somalia.
I thought you were joking when I read that in the book.
Nope.
I literally thought that was just whimsy, just being like inhabiting the role. Holy crap, you were actually a sailor.
Yes, I mean, I'm not in the Navy anymore, so I can't say that I'm a capital S sailor any longer. But yeah, I got my sea legs, right? The sea really is magical. All that guff about like, oh, the magic of the sea. Like, no, it's real, right? If you really go out and spend some time out of sight of land, it's like nothing else. And the people who do that work are like nobody else. And I just really also, among other things, wanted to make this book a love letter to that.
It really is. I mean, there is so much heart in this. You go through, even before you get to the sample adventure, there are actual sea shanties. There's a sea shanty songbook in, man, the DSer is going to be working for it tonight. There's a sea shanty songbook, towards like the mid end of the book. And you start with the real deal stuff. You got the Drunken Sailor in here. You got Alabama in here. You got Blow the Man Down, which is, right over the plate. But these are sea shanties. Do you have a favorite sea shanty out of all the shanties that you've pulled for this book?
Oh, so for just the songs in the book, I'm going to have to say Lowlands Low. Your audience might be more likely to know it by the name Golden Vanity, but it is a song about a ship that is attacked by a pirate, and the little cabin boy says, I can sink the pirate, but in exchange, Captain, I want your daughter for a bride. And he swims over to the pirate side with an auger, and he drills a hole, and the pirate sinks, and he swims back to his ship. And the captain refuses to take him back up, right? I will not marry my daughter to a rapscallion like you. And the kid drowns.
Wow.
It's a lot of fun, and it makes a great adventure, right? Because if the shanty's coming to life, all of a sudden some perfectly innocent member of the crew is playing the role of the cabin boy, and he's like, hey, you see that ship on the horizon there, a perfectly innocent ship and not a pirate. We're all now convinced that it's a pirate because of the magic of the song. I will swim over and I will sink that ship. And it's up to the players to be like, no, don't let him over there. He'll drown. Also, you'll kill all those people. It's a great song in and of itself, but also it makes a terrific adventure.
So it really does come to life in the game. Do we get farewell and adieu, fair Spanish ladies from Jaws, or no? Is that not on the table?
So Spanish ladies, I don't think that Spanish ladies is in the book. One of the things I tried to do with the shanty songbook is to include not just shanties that I think are wonderful, and I love all the ones that are in there, but shanties specifically that make great adventures, right?
Right.
These are songs not about like, oh, I'm cold and the food is bad, but rather about like, hey, so the ship's on fire and that's probably a problem.
Sounds like it. So this Kickstarter is happening now. Dear listener, the Kickstarter for Shanty Hunters is going on now through December the 2nd. Highly recommend you check this out. Tristan, where can people find your work on the internets?
You can find me on Twitter at Molten Sulphur. You can find me on Facebook by the same handle. But the real place to find me to stay up to date on what's going on is at moltensulphur.com. I write the twice Ennie-nominated RPG blog, the Molten Sulphur blog, where every week I take something really cool and interesting from real history or folklore, talk about it, stuff that you're excited to learn about, and then show you how you can file the serial numbers off of it and drop it into the fictional campaign that you are already running tonight and just use it as gaming material. It's a lot of fun, and that's been moltensulphur.com. Check it out. But also check out the Kickstarter.
Yes. More importantly than that, definitely check out the Kickstarter running now through December the 2nd for Shanty Hunters. Tristan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us tonight. And this has been another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They could find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, trying to spread the word about games like Shanty Hunters.
Very cool. You can find me on the Twitter and on the Instagram at John McGuire RPG. I'm posting a lot more because I'm leaving the house these days. You can also check out our Patreon. If you're a fan of the show, if you really love the show, you want to be a little further involved, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/vintageRPG. We've got a behind the scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points. We got a behind the scenes look at my RPG, 3-2-1 Action, and our latest adventure on Kickstarter now, Point Nemo. We've got some great videos. We have a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of. Patreon.com/vintageRPG. And don't forget, folks, rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast because your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.